Good afternoon, and welcome to the first in a series of discussions around debates in sport. This week, we're looking at ethics and gender issues in sport, part one of these debates that will happen around this time on a sequential basis. Of course, we will inform you. We're very happy to have you with us this afternoon as we deal with what is a very important, very emotional, very pressing issue that affects all key stakeholders in sports. Without further ado, as I want you to enjoy all of the presentations and ask many questions, it is my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the Faculty of Sport, that is Dr. Akshay Mansingh, who will bring opening remarks. He is a consultant orthopedic surgeon and sports medicine physician who has looked after several elite athletes throughout the region. So Dr. Mansingh not only has the kind of experience for this discussion, but fundamentally can give you a little overview of our purpose and focus and welcome you to the discussion. Dr. Mansingh?
Thank you very much. I'd like to firstly extend, warm greetings to Dr. Suhan Bharat, who's our moderator from the Institute of Gender and Development Studies in St. Augustine in Trinidad. We're also going to be having Dr. Sasha Sutherland, who's the Executive Director of the Caribbean Regional Anti-Doping Organization, and I believe she's coming in from Barbados. We've got Professor Balaganapati Devarakonda, who is at MONA at UWI, and I specifically call out these names to show you the regional approach that the Faculty of Sport has while I welcome you to this series. Ethics and gender in sport are hot topics. Hot because a lot more attention is being paid to ethics, and a lot more is being discussed, a lot more is being implemented, and a lot more people are being, if you want to say it, penalized or being brought to book if they don't follow the proper ethics. But the whole issue of gender is another sort of open book, which is just being written, because the regulations, the concepts, the acceptance, the diversity is something which is very, very contemporary. I myself am writing policy for cricket along with other colleagues because we don't have a policy in the International Cricket Council. And likewise, there are many other organizations which are writing policy now on biodiversity, on gender issues and so on, simply because we've been confronted by that. So what better time for Faculty of Sport to welcome everybody into a series of discussions on both ethics and gender in sport. And so I welcome everybody. This, of course, is being streamed live, but can be accessible afterwards on our YouTube channel for those who wish to go back and make finer points or make notes on finer points or tell others about it. Welcome all. And I'd like to hand over back to you, Dr. Bharat, but just to say, I wish you all the success for this and the upcoming lectures as we go along.
Thank you, Dr. Mansingh. And indeed, today we expand the conversation from simple biological understandings of sex and bodies to understand the range of experiences and expressions that occur as we contemplate athletes, we contemplate decision makers, we contemplate legislation, we contemplate policy around sport and the ethical considerations that go with that. Our presenters are diverse and bring a range of perspectives, and we encourage you to save your questions as we come to the end during our Q&A period. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and then we follow with our Q&A. Our first speaker is Professor Balaganapathy Devarakonda, and he is a professor of philosophy at the University of Delhi. Professor Bala is presently with us at the University of the West Indies Mona campus and is chair of Indology. His research interests are in the area of Indian philosophy, philosophy of religion, social and political philosophy, and philosophical practice. So you are getting a true introduction into what is the foundation of our conversation this afternoon. In addition to teaching and research, Professor Bala is a certified philosophical counselor by American Philosophy Practitioners Association in New York. He is one of the founding directors of the Philosophical Practitioners Association of India. This is a non-profit organization established for the promotion of philosophical practice in India. Some of his publications include Towards a Bioinformational Understanding of AI, that's in 2022, so get your copy, it's brand new. Youth Participation in Democratic Politics, Impediments and Prospects, Historiography of Indian Philosophy, Reflections on Periodization and Conceptualization, and more, including a focus on conditional designation of artificial legal entities, a post-Anthropocene dynamic jurisprudence from 2021, shifts in classical Indian conception of philosophical practice. This is from 2021. So please, Professor Bala brings with us not only a range of perspectives that you're being introduced to, but a wealth of solid research and analysis. Professor Bala, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Barrett, for that kind introduction. Dr. Mansingh, the Dean of Sports Medicine, other co-panelists of today's session, Dr. Sesha Sutherland and Dr. Travers, and friends who have who are there to listen to us. Thank you so much. Good afternoon to all of you. Can I share my presentation, please? Yeah, I'm really touched by this wonderful initiative that is being brought out by the Faculty of Medicine, Sports Medicine. The series is titled as Debates in Sports Ethics Series, and today and probably a few more sessions we are going to have it on ethics and gender issues in sports. Let me begin this way. Like I understand that this particular session is devoted for introductory one, okay, where we are trying to venture into this area of ethics and gender issues in sports. So that's how I'm limiting myself, because I understand I have only 15 minutes time. I understand. So I try to limit myself to the introductory one, where I would be dealing with what is ethics and what are various ethical theories that are there, and how do we see the difference between professional ethics and general ethics. So these are the three things that I would be focusing today for the discussion. Let me begin this way. Like, what is ethics? I don't want to discuss what is ethics in terms of giving bookish definitions, etc. I'm not interested in that. Let us have a look at it this way, that when we talk about ethics, or when we talk about a person by name Mr. Johnson, okay, I'm just taking a example of Mr. Johnson. It can be anybody. So when we talk about somebody like Mr. Johnson being ethical, what is it that we are talking about? And what is it that we are looking at when we talk about Mr. Johnson being ethical? Obviously, what we can have access to is only his actions that he performs and the way he talks. Okay, we know the other individual only through these two instruments of to which we have accessibility. So that's how, like an individual, when we try to understand when he is ethical or not, only two instruments that we have access to, or like one is how he acts and what he speaks, right? So if that is the case, look at the individual. You can assess yourself as well. When you act and speak in a particular way, what is it that works, that makes you act and speak in a particular way? Obviously, it is your thinking. The way you think is the one which helps you to talk in a particular way, act in a particular way. So all your actions are dependent on your thinking. Everything that you speak is also dependent on your thinking. And if thinking is the basis of acting and speaking, then why is it that, or why does a particular person think in a particular way? Okay, and the answer to this is the thinking is based on the way you have conceptualized your relation with the other. What I mean by the other is, other could be other individuals, animals, or the nature. Okay, other is everything other than you that exists around you, and you can call it world. You can call it nature. You can call it social world or economical world or whatever cultural world that exists around you. So basically, your thinking is rooted in how you have conceptualized yourself or your thinking in relation to the world around you. So this is a very important aspect. I'm trying to slowly take you into philosophy, but I'm not using any of these philosophical terminologies so that we can be comfortable in moving further to what I'm trying to take you to. So that's how whatever you act and speak is rooted in thinking, and thinking is rooted in how you relate yourself with the world. And this is what we call worldview. Each one of us have a worldview which is different from the other individuals, and which is unique to each one of us. Okay, so this is a very important aspect, because this worldview is filled with different belief systems that we have. Whether you want to consider somebody to be inferior, somebody to be superior, somebody to be colored, somebody to be something, it's all based on the belief system that you have in your mind, through which you relate yourself to the world around you. Okay, so that's very important aspect that I would like to touch here. And this is what basically, friends, what we call metaphysics. And metaphysics is not beyond physics. Unfortunately, some people consider it to be that way. Metaphysics is something that is there in your mind, your worldview, right? If that is the case, let me take you to one step further to explain you how ethics is related to this. And I'm calling this the way you relate yourself to the world as the worldview. So if that is the worldview, how is this worldview constructed? Is it just constructed? Is it that something that you are born with, or is it that you construct it for yourself, or the world constructs it for you? So in a way, it happens through the mixture of everything. So the worldview is basically the way you have started learning to know about yourself and know about your relations with the world. Which means basically, if there are some people have argued saying that this worldview that you construct is on the basis of your culture, on the basis of your economic condition, it's on the basis of your many other segregated aspects that you construct your worldview on. Some people argue that it is on the basis of genetic material. But interestingly, two people from the same family, okay, two siblings may have different worldviews, though they are from the same genetic makeup and from the same cultural background, same socio-economic background. Which means the uniqueness of the individual is not completely determined by any of these individual aspects that I have mentioned in terms of genetic makeup or socio-economic conditions, rather than how I react, how I understand the world and start reacting and conceptualizing my worldview is very important. That is how both your siblings would be reacting to the same world, same incident, same aspect in different ways. So, which means the way you have learned to look at the world, the way you have learned to relate yourself to the world is very important. And that is how your worldview is constructed. So, when we ask this question like, Mr. Johnson is ethical, we have only access to how he acts and what he talks. But actually, the root of it is all these aspects, like what he thinks, how he thinks, and then how he has conceptualized the world, and how he was taught to conceptualize the world, on the basis of which he reacted and interacted with the world. So that's how the epistemology, metaphysics are the ones which make you act in the world in a particular way. So that's how when we ask this question, like whether somebody is ethical, we are deeply asking this question of how one has learned to conceptualize the reality around himself, how one has conceptualized his relation with the world around him. So that is how, if you're expecting an individual to be ethical, you should be educating them about what ethics is. okay, without introducing it to the individual. If you start talking about ethics, it becomes very difficult, because you're imposing something that is not introduced to the individual. And that is where ethics is seen to be something that is into the domain of human action, and what to do or what not to do is the question that ethics tries to address at the fundamental level. Now, what I'm talking about, Mr. Johnson, is only at the individual level. When we talk about sports ethics, now, if you see Mr. Johnson to be a sports person, so are we talking about same thing, same kind of ethics with regard to Mr. Johnson as an individual and Mr. Johnson as a sports person? That's an interesting aspect that we have to look at, because professions are different from individuals. That is how the general individual ethics and the sports ethics or professional ethics could be different slightly. Okay, when I'm saying this, what I mean is professions are institutions in themselves, and each institution goes beyond the individuals and tries to set up its own rules and regulations, and it will have its own people with whom they deal with, right? So that is how the individual ethics and professional ethics sometimes seem to be overlapping with each other, but also going diverging from each other. For instance, telling a lie could be wrong in general ethics and individual ethics, but when you take it up to the medical ethics, sometimes telling a lie to a patient may be a good one. So that is how, when we take it beyond the general ethics and take it to the professional ethics may demand certain more things than what general ethics demands. That is how the ethical domain within professional ethics is slightly divergent. That's what I wanted to establish here, so that in the subsequent discussions, when we talk about professional ethics or sports ethics, we would be able to see the distinction between general ethics and professional ethics. And profession, basically, friends, when we look at it, there should be a difference between occupation and profession, right? An occupation becomes a profession when a group of individuals sharing the same occupation organize to work in a morally permissible way, or to look to support a moral ideal. That is how they create their own standards of the profession, which would go beyond sometimes what law, marketplace, or ordinary morality or public opinion demand. So that's the distinction that I would like to establish. Let me take it further to introducing what are different ethical theories that we come across. In ethics, there are three things which are very important. As I said, I understand that I have 5 more minutes. Let me complete it quickly. Let me introduce these ethical theories that I would like to place before you. When you look at human action, there can be three things that are very fundamental to human action: agent, action, and outcome of the action. On the basis of each one of them, there are different ethical theories that have developed. For example, some people have argued that outcome of an action is very important, and outcome of an action is the one which has to be taken into consideration for considering an action to be ethical. That's how we have a theoretical perspective called consequentialism that has come into existence. So the theoretical, the scholars who have rooted ethics on the outcome of the action are called consequentialists. And there are certain professors, there are certain scholars who have argued that action should be the root of considering something to be ethical or unethical, and these are called deontologists. And some people have argued that it is the agent who is very important, and this is where you have an ethical perspective called virtue ethics coming into existence. Let me explain these three through an example. Say, for example, a kid is fell into the river, and the river is moving in a swift current, and nobody is there to help, and everybody looks at the other and tries to shout for help. And in between, okay, after a few minutes, somebody jumps into the river and saves the kid, and the kid is saved. The consequences are good, so everybody appreciated the individual on the basis of the consequence. The consequence is to save the kid. Okay, now this is what consequentialism argues. If the consequences are good, it should be ethical. Then the mother of the kid comes there and looks at, feels happy about the rescue of the kid, and looks at the gentleman who has saved and says, "Oh, you saved our kid," which means the person who has saved is the kid's father. Okay, when you understand, when you look at the rescuer to be the father, you think that, okay, that's his duty, it's his father's duty to save the kid, and he has done it. So this is a perspective called deontology, where you be ethical on the basis of being understanding it to be your duty. And then this gentleman who has saved looked around and said, "Who the hell has pushed me into the river?" Okay. Then people understood that this gentleman doesn't have any intention of jumping into the river. He was pushed. That is how he saved the kid. Now, since he doesn't have an intention of saving the kid, you think that it's not ethical. Okay. So in the first instance, since the boy is saved, you have given him 100% ethical value, because the consequence is important. When you came to know to the end that he doesn't have an intention of saving the kid, that is, oh, he did not initially jump, or he did not on his own did not jump into the river, so you consider it to be like, oh, there is no ethical value. So these are three different ethical perspectives that are very important for us. One is consequentialism, which talks about results, and deontology, which talks about the duty and the virtue, being cultivating a virtue which is based on intentions of the individual. So these are important ethical perspectives that I thought I should introduce. In the subsequent, if we have some questions, I can respond to them. And in the subsequent sessions, I would like to take up certain case studies within this gender issue related to sports ethics. And thank all of you for giving me this wonderful opportunity. Thank you. I would stop it here. Yeah, thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Professor Bala. What you've done for us so well is lay a foundation for us to understand the what of our conversation. That is the ethics that are in debate when we consider sport and the participants in sport and the bodies and selves in sport. We really get that basis. And this introduction of the three theoretical perspectives kind of gives us a sense of how we evaluate those actions, which you say are at the center of evaluating both the individual and the professional. So we really appreciate you connecting the dots for us so we understand the basis of our ethical considerations as individuals and, of course, as a member of a collective, be it a profession or other kind of collective. Of course, save your questions for Professor Bala at the end, when we may pick up some of these foundational elements on ethics, and of course, as they manifest in sport. Our second speaker is Dr. Sasha Sutherland. When it comes to passion, to passionate advocacy, indeed, for equity, and I dare say equality and justice, and leveling playing fields in sports, you'll find no greater proponent than Dr. Sasha Sutherland, Executive Director of the Caribbean Regional Anti-Doping Organization, RADO. In her role there, she manages teams in the 18 Caribbean RADO member countries by ensuring that rules, regulations, education, and testing are maintained at international standards, which she anticipates will redound to the benefit of all athletes competing in sport. So she's taking care of our people. With a desire to increase awareness around issues of gender inequality, governance, and doping in sport, Sasha is a part-time lecturer at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, sports science and tourism programs. She also serves as a director of the Barbados Olympic Association Incorporated, where she is the chair of the Education Commission and a member of the Governance Commission. Sasha is extending her advocacy everywhere. Congratulations to Sasha. Dr. Sunderland is also a member of the National Compliance Platform for Anti-Doping in Barbados, a former curriculum developer and lecturer in the Hague University of Applied Sciences International Sport Management Program, and a former and adjunct professor and visiting scholar in sport management at George Mason University in Virginia. Dr. Sunderland holds a BSc in psychology with literatures in English, an advanced diploma in sport management, and a PhD in cultural studies. She is dynamic. Her research interests are gender and sport, race and sport, and of course, anti-doping in sport. She has published work on menstrual health and sport for development. So I know some of our listeners are key to follow you up on that. On women and race in sport, another hot topic. Dr. Sunderland also holds certificates in coaching, football in particular, and was a national team football manager and referee in Barbados. She's a former triple distance athlete of lawn tennis, football, and hockey, and brings her knowledge of being an athlete, administrator, and academic together to inform the world in any way she can. So join me in welcoming this activist, this advocate, this educator, and policymaker. Dr. Sunderland, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Dr. Barrett. Thank you so much for having me. You were reading that, and I'm like, who is this person? But let me jump right in because I could talk about gender and sport for the entire day, 15 minutes. So what I like about Professor Bala's concepts just now is that he spoke about how one has learned to conceptualize the world around them. And so if you want an individual to be ethical, you have to educate them about what ethics is. So I want to start the gender discussion from the beginning. We are aware of the benefits of sport. However, sport is problematic because the management of sport is laced with inequalities across race and gender. So while men and women play sport, there's a stark contrast in how genders are encouraged, managed, and perceived in the Caribbean, related to different and unequal experiences rooted in identity and relations of gender and power. So I use Professor Barreto's definition of gender as a complex system of personal and social relations through which women and men are socially created and maintained, and through which they gain access to or are allocated status, power, and material resources within society. So when we talk about gender equality in sport, what we're talking about is a state of equal access to resources and opportunities, regardless of our gender, including economic participation and decision-making, and the way in which we value different behaviors, aspirations, and needs equally, regardless of gender. So when we speak about gender equality in sport, we need to be mindful that we're talking about discrimination against women's participation in sport. We're talking about sexism in sport related to uniforms, relating to the way in which we think about women and girls' participation. And we're also talking about disparities surrounding funding, surrounding media coverage, surrounding gender marking, and access to opportunities for leadership and coaching. We're also talking about issues such as the gender pay gap between male and female athletes. We're considering lack of representation across middle to upper levels of management and leadership. And more recently, when we speak about gender inequality, we're talking about quotas. Do these help or hurt in governance and leadership? For example, is it fair for a spot to be reserved for someone based on their gender? And we're also talking about gender diverse campaigning and lobbying in sport. What we need to consider is that sport traditionally has been male-centered, male-dominated, and male-identified, a space where masculine hegemony, patriarchy, and domination have been core tenets. So gender then becomes a dichotomous engagement over women's rights to be included, respected, or earn positions of power in sport. The discourse on gender has also included changing the premises on which we build sport to ensure that difference between genders do not result in inequity between men and women or among masculinities and femininities in sport. Sport should instead embrace difference and offer inclusionary practices according to its positive philosophy for being. So at the base level of discussion surrounding gender inequality is the belief that women should prove their right to be engaged in sport, despite evidence that challenges the naturalization of gender difference and inequality as rudimentary aspects of this institution. What has stayed on the discourse in gender and sport is that those who hold the power within sport are men, in spite of the agency that women in some societies use to coerce power from their male counterparts. In the Caribbean, the challenges around gender are revealed through things like token representations of inclusivity. So, for example, you may have a female football match before the main game, and the main game is understood as a men's game. Then we think about ideological notions that women have no place in sport, which guide gendered constructs around masculinities and femininities in sport and society. So this is where we consider things like there are normal, natural, and proper behaviors for men and women, which are then hinged to acceptable behaviors in sport or acceptable sport for boys and men and for girls and women. And within the Caribbean space, the absence of policy to guide decision-making or to mainstream gender in sport roots the fact that sport has been all but excluded from development in Caribbean context. So the point here is that not all countries have national sport policies that guide practice, and then where there are sport policies, they're not explicit about the treatment of gender. And I just want to go back to the point that the absence of policy in sport is also rooted in the fact that sport itself has been excluded from economic development contexts in the Caribbean. So then we look at international federation policies and regulations to determine gender equitable investment in and the development of women's sport. And our best example of this is the FIFA Financial Assistance Program, through which their national member organizations benefit. So in the interest of time, I want to just look at policy and leadership and governance. What I want to make clear is that policy doesn't always equate to action. That policy has to be operationalized. So sport was not even considered an area of concern, for example, in the regional program of action for CARICOM, the Caribbean community, nor is there regional policy for sport development. So while CARICOM acknowledges that sport is an important part of community life and development, particularly among the region's youth, that has not influenced the way we practice sport in the Caribbean. And then at the country level, not many policies, sport policies that is, have included gender equality in their frameworks. And even when they do, the realities listed are different to what is stated. I'll give two examples of that. In 2011, Jamaica's national policy for gender equality addressed equality in all of its ministries, including the Ministry of Youth, Sports, and Culture. The policy indicated a willingness to increase access to funding for female and male athletes competing in sports and athletics events, which are traditionally dominated by the opposite sex. Yet, the 2013 white paper on the national sport policy acknowledged that what currently happens is the opposite. So it said, it basically read that despite the growing participation of women in sport in recent years and increased opportunities for women to participate in domestic and international arenas, increased representation for women in decision-making and leadership roles within sport has not followed. Women are significantly underrepresented in management, coaching, and officiating, particularly at the highest level. Without women leaders, decision makers, and role models within sport, equal opportunities for girls and women will not be achieved. The second example I want to use in terms of policy is the Trinidad and Tobago National Sport Policy, where they acknowledge that sport lacked policy and resources to facilitate development in the context of sport, increasing scientific, competitive, and professional nature within the country. So that policy focused on total participation in sport and high performance sport. Of the 8 objectives they identified, number 3 stated there was this willingness to encourage and provide for the fullest participation of women and girls in all areas of sport, consistent with the 1994 Brighton Declaration on Women in Sport. But one observation with Trinidad and Tobago's policy is that there's no mention collaboration with the Ministry of Gender, Youth and Child Development, whose aim at the time was to champion evidence-based policy making, program implementation, and high-quality, accessible, and effective service delivery to advance gender equality, the rights of the child, and youth development. So what happens in practice when you step away from policy and you look at what's happening with our federations? In confederations like CONCACAF in football, there are issues of disparity in local programming that, although obvious, are not being addressed. So, for example, female football in the Caribbean struggles with the triple burden of lack of support, funding, and development. And among the reasons for this state are gender bias, poor organizational structures, a lack of visibility, infrastructure, and sponsorship. Yet, the Jamaica women's football team would be at the 2024 Women's World Cup in Australia. Other football teams in the Caribbean have similar experiences as seen in the 2014 debacle with the Trinidad and Tobago women's football team in the US and the Barbados women's team ahead of the Gold Cup stage in the same year. So because women continue to be seen in relation to and opposed to men in sport, policies that privilege women lag behind those constructed for men. As a result, matters like funding and investment and equitable distribution of resources continue to be unequal. So if we look at governance quickly, I want to say that unequal relations of gender, and I'm going to use cricket in this regard, in the Caribbean, like football, seem to be entrenched in our structures. So if we look at the 2007 Committee on Governance of Cricket of West Indies Cricket, the report indicated a regional aspiration to return to the glory days of West Indies cricket. That aspiration was deeply desired by Caribbean people who see our identity and awareness of self rooted in cricket of the 70s and 80s. The process to reinvigorate cricket was believed to rest in a transformative process within schools and clubs, as well as in national and regional teams. But if you look at the context of sport within schools and national teams, it is predominantly male-based. So notably, the glory days refer to a period when male cricketers were privileged and the achievements and involvement in the game by women were often ignored. So Professor Sir Hilary Beckles in the governance reports forward had actually stated that in the recent past, there has been an encouraging revival in women's cricket. And it has been agreed at the International Cricket Council level that the integration of men and women's cricket should take place. The then West Indies board had agreed on the conditions under which the integration would take place between itself and the then West Indies Women's Cricket Federation, but neither party had satisfied conditions. There was an urgency in making sure that happened. In the end, the governance report indicated that the recommendations regarding equity in the governance of West Indies cricket have seemingly not been considered by the then West Indies Cricket Board. So the international mandate for gender integration and equal representation for cricket was there, but the male-dominated board determined that the conditions for such a merger in the Caribbean. The approach then is a continuance of exclusionary practices towards women with regard to matters concerning them, suggesting that in relations of gender in sport, there is an unmindfulness of the rights of women. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip to two ideological premises that remain in governance. First, I want to say that in relations of gender, the privileging of men results in women being othered. Social relations of gender render sport like cricket and football as male-centered, male-dominated, male-identified. Gender as a category determines institutional and material support for teams, consequently perpetuating an unfair playing field for women. So the lived experiences for men and women in football or in cricket, far from revealing a neutral terrain that advances both genders equally, exposes a bias towards male privileging in sport, and it also others persons who identify as gender diverse or transgender, etc. The second point I want to make is that theory speaks to the prevalence of masculine hegemony in patriarchal sports, but determined to succeed against pecuniary difficulties, female footballers find themselves surrounded by sexuality discourses. And then their responses become such as what follows. women engage in a type of apologetic behavior, such as the beautification before competition, to appear more feminine, downplaying their strength and aggression, or emphasizing their heterosexuality so they're not perceived as lesbian, a negative stereotype in our hypo-heterosexualized Caribbean society. So this behavior reinforces gender hierarchies and the performance of gender among female athletes. We continue to approach binary conceptions of gender within society, and performing gender identity becomes a female apologetic. What is masculine is not feminine, and vice versa. And it reinforces a position that gender is an embodying performance for men and women. Athletic performance has been privileged for women and sport in recent times, ensuring women are respected for their competitiveness in sport and minimizing the need for female apologetic behaviors. But the concept of beautification hinges on agency as much as it does on the female apologetic. So what I would conclude by saying, because I'm aware that, we're probably close to time, is that in Caribbean society, sport is an integral part of many females' lives. It's used to promote physical fitness, social status, and mobility, right? So for the talented boy or girl, sport could be the vehicle for upward mobility if traditional avenues of education or advantaged family backgrounds were not viable. What we need to do then is create space for partnerships where we celebrate each other's uniqueness towards benefits, or engage in publicly supporting competent women leaders while challenging restrictive male-female gender norms in sport to create a sustainable model of recognizing difference but treating participants as equals. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Sunderland. Treating all partners as equal, as to be included. You really drew us to contemplate not only the necessity in the lives of those who follow this path into sport, but the frameworks, structures, and systems that affect how we can experience it and how we can get closer to our ethical goals around policy, leadership, and governance. You also led us really early, tying back to Professor Bala, to contemplate the defaults, the taken for granted defaults that we rely on when we think of sport, that we confront and contemplate when we think of the issues that we have inherited and that are emerging as relevant in the contemporary environment. So we really enjoyed your presentation and followed along with you as you drew us into a contemplative mood. And so save your questions for Dr. Sunderland. I'm sure you have a lot. We move to our final speaker this evening, and this is Professor Travers. Professor Travers is a professor of sociology at Simon Fraser University. Their recent book, The Trans Generation: How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution, available to you, situates trans kids in Canada and the US, white settler nations characterized by significant social inequality. In addition to a central research focus on transgender children and youth, Dr. Travers has published extensively on the relationship between sport and social justice, with particular emphasis on the inclusion and exclusion of women, queer, and trans people of all ages. So we continue with our theme from the basis of ethics to social advocacy to, again, this extended conversation that we get with Dr. Travers. A current research program in this field focuses on gender equity in youth baseball. Dr. Travers is deputy editor of the journal Gender and Society and head coach of an 18 under AAA youth baseball team. I hope I said that correctly.
You did.
And great. With that, I hand over the floor to you, Dr. Travers.
Thank you so much. It's an incredible honor to be invited to speak here today, and I hope that I get to meet all of you in person one day, either where you are or where I am, which is before noon in Vancouver, Canada. Let me just begin by sharing my screen. Never mind. This is a little bit more complicated than I thought, so I'll skip the PowerPoint. Sorry for the stop and go start there. The slides aren't really that important. According to a 2016 report by the Williams Institute, 0.42% of the population, meaning just under half of 1% of the population in the United States, identifies as transgender. Educational psychologist Mark Helen observes that most transgender children are invisible, and it's reasonable to assume that many remain so throughout their lives. The extent to which trans and non-binary people expect to be welcomed or excluded and even villainized in our social worlds has a huge impact on our decisions about making ourselves known to others. Hateful political campaigns that seek to deny transgender people basic rights, including access to appropriate bathrooms and participation in sport, are deliberate attempts to create hostile climates and drive us back underground. It is no accident that organized sport is a site for contesting the inclusion of transgender people, and that transgender girls and women are the primary targets of these campaigns. After all, today's sporting environments are an outgrowth of the precedents established since modern sport emerged in Europe and its colonies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a, quote, civilizing project. Binary sex differentiation and male superiority were equated with civilization, whereas other more fluid and egalitarian gender and sexuality systems were regarded as primitive, which justified colonialism, genocide, the slave trade. While the assumption that girls and women are an inferior form of humanity has been formally, although not materially and culturally eradicated in such nations, gender inequality is still institutionalized in sport via pervasive sex segregation, pay inequity, etc. The assumption of biological advantage for male athletes across the board is a central ideological feature of the West. While transgender people have had some success in gaining recognition and human rights in the West in the past decade, a well-financed reactionary movement is attempting to roll back these gains. A constellation of white supremacist and religiously conservative organizations and movements are in collusion with so-called gender-critical feminists or trans-exclusionary radical feminists to resist challenges to traditional gender hierarchies by targeting trans girls and women more so than trans boys, trans men, and non-binary people for surveillance and exclusion. In the past several years, bills designed to delegitimize and exclude trans people in various ways have been introduced and signed into law in many US state legislatures, and anti-trans sport policy has taken hold in the United Kingdom. Campaigns to restrict the participation of trans girls and women in sport rely on generating moral panics to convince people that trans girls and women pose a threat to cisgender women and girls. Moral panics occur when the media is employed to create a social crisis that requires increased criminalization and surveillance of a typically marginalized group. The objects of moral panics enable the displacement of social anxieties onto a scapegoat, a group unrelated to the source of the anxiety. Unsurprisingly, the group targeted for discipline in a moral panic is not the actual cause of the problem. Indeed, the cause of the problem is typically located within institutions and actors whose damaging impact is seen as normal and therefore invisible. The concept of moral panic has been applied to a wide range of issues and actors, significantly including the penis panics generated by anti-trans campaigns to exclude trans girls and trans women from using women's bathrooms and changing facilities. Anti-trans campaigns lend themselves to inflammatory language and unfounded claims that are effective in mobilizing populist sentiment and political backlash. Anti-trans rhetoric claiming that trans girls and women are fundamentally male and therefore predatory have been used as a dog whistle for new fascist movements to build and mobilize their base. It is no accident, for example, that Trump identified trans girls and trans women participating in girls and women's sport as a threat to the nation in his January 6, 2021 speech just before he incited his followers to seize the US Capitol. Referring to the USA, Libby Sharrow and others observed that proponents claim that women's sports require protection from transgender athletes, even as they are unable to provide examples of trans athletes competing in their states. The authors go on to note that the Center for American Progress finds that including trans high school athletes does not reduce cisgender girls' involvement in sport, and that actual support for transgender athletes is widespread, including from high school and NCAA athletes themselves, high-profile women athletes, and a large number of women's rights and gender justice organizations. The human right of transgender athletes to participate in all aspects of society, although far from universally affirmed and experienced, is often seen by mainstream sports organizations and the wider public to be justifiably limited in sport. The characteristic debate about the inclusion of trans athletes involves questions as to the extent to which hormone therapy effectively achieves physiologically equivalency between trans women and non-trans women by changing biological characteristics associated with assumed male athletic advantage. Anti-trans movements rely on common sense assumptions that boys have an athletic advantage over girls from birth, a claim which is simply false. Concerns about the participation of transgender women and girls in sport presume that these athletes have an unfair advantage in women's competitions because of the legacy effect of greater exposure to testosterone. The testosterone panic these movements produce rests on the claim that transgender girls and women, by virtue of having been assigned male at birth, retain at least some of this natural advantage. The operating assumption that women's sports needs to be protected from athletes with male traits means that policies relating to transgender participation are linked to rules for women athletes with hyperandrogenism, a medical term imposed on women who naturally produce levels of testosterone higher than the female norm. According to these policies, trans women who experience male puberty and women with hyperandrogenism should be required to undergo testosterone suppression treatment to achieve physiological equivalency with cisgender women. The assumptions about binary sex difference and female inferiority that motivate and animate female eligibility policies have been put under the microscope by human rights and science-based challenges to each succeeding practice of sex verification testing for women athletes, with the overwhelming consensus that sex is not binary. There are more than two sexes, and that sex testing is flawed. The practice of mandatory sex testing for all women athletes was abandoned by the IAAF in 1992 and the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, in 2000, but selective testing of so-called suspicious athletes continues. Many scholars draw attention to the extent to which selective sex testing is disproportionately deployed against Black and brown women from the global South. So what's the panic about transgender participation in female sport? Bills and laws seeking to prevent trans girls and women from participating in female sport stoke a testosterone panic in sport by positioning trans girls and women as testosterone-fueled boys and men, a cruel and deliberate disavowal of the right of such girls and women to gender self-determination. Employing such language reinforces the presumption of biological sex immutability and works to refuse to recognize the legitimacy of transgender people. Such anti-trans movements claim that all the gains that girls and women have made in sport will be taken away by boys and men masquerading as girls and women. It's no accident that one of the focal points of public discourse relating to the participation of trans girls in the USA concerns two young Black trans women competing in female track events at the high school level. In 2021, After years of criticism by leading scientists in fields related to sex development and human rights activists, the IOC finally acknowledged that the evidence it relied upon about the effect of higher levels of testosterone on athletic performance was, as its critics had insisted all along, unsupported by the science. While the new IOC policy on women with hyperandrogenism is refreshing in that it rules out medically unnecessary treatment and acknowledges the profound harm to women athletes that resulted from past regulations, it's deeply concerning for other reasons. The new policy supports a sport-by-sport assessment that allows the IOC to abdicate any role it has ever had to support the human rights of transgender athletes. It is now up to individual sport associations and federations to do the dirty work of drawing boundaries between real and unreal girls and women. The harm that such assessments will produce have materialized with the World Rugby's 2020 ban on the participation of transgender women in international female rugby competitions, based on the false claim that trans women retain vestigial strength that makes their participation unsafe for their cisgender counterparts. The NCAA recently followed suit in January of 2022 by replacing its leading-edge transgender inclusive policy, adopted in 2011, with a similar sport-by-sport policy that enables banning transgender women from certain sports. The recent success of NCAA swimmer Leah Thomas, a transgender woman who has been breaking records, sparked the International Swimming Federation to restrict transgender women from participating in women's events, promising to introduce a third category soon. I'm just going to wrap up by saying the question for us about what is considered a natural versus unnatural advantage, it needs to be understood as a social rather than a scientific decision. Why is the dominance in the pool of Katie Ledecky, a cisgender woman, for example, accepted? Why are men who have unusual or have higher than normal levels of natural testosterone, why are they not prevented from competing in men's categories because they're higher than the norm? And finally, we have to look at the role of racism in targeting certain athletes for restricting. I think back to the 2016 Olympics when a Chinese woman beat the time of U.S. male swimmer Ryan Lochte in a heat. What did Western media do? It was full of accusations of doping, because it's not possible for a woman to outperform a man. So anytime a woman performs well athletically, the fear is she performs too well and her femininity is, called into question. So these are social decisions. One of the things I could say is one of the most unnatural advantages that certain athletes, particularly from the global north, have is access to top line nutrition and training. Think about all the kids who do not get adequate diet. They are not able to participate on any kind of level playing field. So what gets considered to be a fair advantage versus an unfair advantage, a natural versus an unnatural, those are social rather than scientific decisions. And I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Travers. And you end where we began, where we started to contemplate a huge ethical consideration that extends into legislative policymaking and process work, which is what is fair? What is an advantage? What is not? Does this rest in social perceptions and actions of people, or does this rest in some sort of biology equaling destiny, which we have seen established over time is unreliable? We really appreciate that thought because you bring the complex set of issues that have a profound impact on key stakeholders in sport and a profound impact on inclusion and exclusion. We contemplated through your presentation sanctioned exclusionary practices, moral panics being a huge one, all of the fallacies of misplaced scale and so much. Policy implementation that in part is challenged but is retained in some way. Counter advocacy groups, anti-trans movements, the source of extensive rhetoric to counter inclusivity, and so forth. So we really and truly appreciate what you have added to us, our contemplation of what is valued and how do we measure this valuation and thresholds as such. So thank you all to all our presenters this afternoon. I think we have a lot to think about, and I think we have a lot to think about these hot topics as the dean encourages to contemplate. So I open the floor to questions. Please, you can raise your hand, signal who you'd like to ask your question to, or if you want to direct it to the entire panel, you can drop it in the chat, or questions or comments. Please keep it succinct so we can take as many as possible in the few minutes that we have left. Great, okay. Okay, from Grace Jackson. Now, I saw the first part of the question. I'm not sure if I could scroll up. Are you all seeing it on the screen?
Yes.
Right. Is it that the equity for women are placed in documents?
As in writing.
Yes, so is it written, but we don't have a desire to practice it in society? That's our first question.
Right. So I'll take that as a policy question for gender equality in sports. And I would say that in some documents in the region, equality is absent. It's not spelt out in that there should be equal representation, etc. We tend to allude to the fact that this is about sport for all, and everyone having a right to participate in sport, youth development, etc. But even in documents where there is a written premise that this is about equity or equality or access, or where gender is mainstreamed, operationally, there is no action. So in some documents it's missing, but even where it's written, the operational side of it, they tend to say, well, we will action it when we talk about operational plans. But if it's not written into policy, there is no obligation on the part of a technocrat to say there is this understanding that we must achieve parity for gender. And in the same way that if we don't start writing policies for gender diverse athletes, there's no guarantee that we're going to act on something that's not written into policy.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Sunderland. And Professor Travers also kind of mentioned another side of that, which is, I suppose, contradictory application or application in part. Would you like to elaborate, Prof?
A little bit. I mean, one of the things that is really important to understand about the anti-trans campaigns that are happening in the United States and in the United Kingdom by religious conservatives, the Christian right, etc., who are also very closely tied to white supremacist ethno-fascist movements. They don't care about women's sport at all. They're talking about, oh my God, women's sport. We need to protect women and girls from trans women. These are not people who are interested in women and girls at all. In fact, the long-term goal of the Christian right in the United States is to create a biblical state with restrictive heteropatriarchal laws and customs. So it's really important to unpack these claims, because these are not allies for women in sport at all.
Exactly. And while we wait for another question, I wanted to turn it over to Professor Bala just to share your perspective on, what we are contemplating, even with that question about what is said and what is done and how we view the impact of that.
Yeah, actually, if we look at the whole discourse that is happening and also the discussion that happened a few minutes back, it's like everything boils down to this issue of who is a person, okay? Who is a human being,
Yes.
and how do you start defining it? And these definitions are always sometimes dirty. The definitions themselves are dirty. Let me pardon me for using such kind of a word, but yeah, sometimes, most of the times, definitions are very dirty, in the sense that, see, when people initially looked at the concept of person, they tried to define it in terms of somebody who has autonomy of the will, who can be independent. So in that sense, they have excluded so many people from the domain, saying that they cannot be independent, right? For example, slaves, women were excluded, children were excluded. So this went on, and later on they have said the definitions have set in such a way that it can be more inclusive, in the sense that let us define it in terms of somebody who can exercise freedom, who has rationality, and then who is not completely emotionally moved, but who can rationalize thinking and emotion. Then this is how the definitions of person have evolved over a period of time. Now when the issue comes to transgender, like identification of the femininity has become a major issue. That's where physical examination, I think, if you look at the history, the first case has come up where somebody was physically examined by doctors, and then they have tested the person to be a feminine, of feminine gender, and then later on it was taken up to chromosomes. And then it was taken up further to testosterone, and we don't know how far they would these definitions and verifications, scientific verifications, would go on, and how far we continue to exclude, no, the other,
Yes.
and keep normalizing the processes and the people. So
Can I just jump in to
Yes.
say that every single woman in international competition was sex tested from the 60s through 2000. Every single woman. It started with nude parades. Women had to stand in front of, a panel of doctors and be examined. And then it was chromosomes. And then and all the time, the entire time this was happening, the leading scientists in the fields of sex development said, you are not doing what you think you're doing. This is not scientific. But it's horrifying.
The system.
I appreciate your emphasis on this: who is human, who is not human. I wonder if you're a fan of the fabulous scholar Sylvia Wynter, who centers very much the notion of distinguishing who is human and inhuman in the process of colonialism, slavery, etc. And this notion of white supremacist heteropatriarchy is the biggest export that Europe has ever had. And we see its legacy, it's so pervasive.
Indeed. We have another question, which we will take. A question from Anand Ramprasad. Dr. Ramprasad, how do you start introducing transgender discussion in sport policy? I want to go around the circle, starting with Dr. Sunderland, and then we move to Professor Travers, and then to Professor Bala.
So the most recent example of this that I can give is where I work in anti-doping. And so there is now a guiding policy for how we treat with athletes who identify as gender diverse or transgender. And so recognizing that it doesn't necessarily solve the entire discussion or discourse around transgender and gender diverse athletes, what we have been able to understand is that where an athlete identifies as their sport gender, they will be treated as such. And it just comes back to the whole idea that every athlete has a right and a responsibility to participate in sport. And how do we honor the right of an athlete to say, I identify as X, without it being an imposition of our own moral position on that athlete? And so within anti-doping, there are guidelines. We actually just went through that process with our doping control officers about not imposing your own moral reservations, but you're there to collect a sample. And so if an athlete who appears to you as male, identifies as female, and has entered a competition as a sport gendered female, we treat the athlete as such and with respect. So that's the most recent example that I can give in terms of policies in doping control that treat with transgender athletes and gender diverse athletes.
And the discussion. Yes. Professor Travers, from your perspective, how do we start introducing this discussion in social policy?
Well, I certainly agree with Dr. Ramprasad that gender self-identification is the way to go. But, there's a bigger problem, and that is sex-segregated sport to begin with. And if you look at it just in terms of occupational inequity, it's quite stark. It's like, male athletes can earn, millions of dollars, whereas, Brittany Griner has to go to Russia to, pay the bills. But the thing is that, sport emerged in the 18th and 19th century certainly as a, like as a celebration of white supremacy and masculinity. Like it was deliberately exclusive of girls and women, and its purpose is to normalize the assumption that men should lead, that the unequal distribution of resources. So in some of my own work, I'm interested in looking at reorganizing sport entirely. And there are examples, the Paralympics, or boxing, wrestling, they use weight class. Or I'm particularly interested in baseball. Everybody has to be obsessed with a sport. That's mine. And you have like an MVP one year who's 5'6", and an MVP another year who's 6'9". They're not really comparable, but neither of their teams were going to win without them. So, you have this phenomenal overlap among men. And then you ask yourself, well, why couldn't a woman play Major League Baseball? Why couldn't someone who identifies as non-binary? But you have this systematic like institutional process for streaming out girls from baseball and developing boys. And there's also the the offshore issue of the Dominican Republic and the exploitive sort of minor league systems, etc. But for me, I would start to look at sport and say, how could we reorganize sport in a different way that is more inclusive for everybody? That like, why should it just be male female? And it certainly shouldn't result in occupational inequity. But in the moment, I certainly argue for gender self-determination as the basis for participation in currently institutional sport.
Yes. And from that perspective, discussed by both Dr. Sunderland and then Professor Travers, Professor Bala, I wonder if you can help us understand, how do we then get into the mindset of the policymakers? How do we then get into the personal threshold versus the professional threshold? How do we contend with that disconnect?
Wonderful. Yeah, that's the point. Now, we have to understand that no policy is a localized policy, especially when it comes to sports. Every policy decision is a globalized one. We talk about globalization and globalized world and world becoming a small village, and then we don't give space to the diversity, which means what is it that you're looking at when you're looking at the sports policy? And for me, it's like more than just introducing the discussion. I would say a lot of discussion, a lot of awareness has to be generated, okay, with regard to inclusion of transgender, and also looking at gender beyond the binary position. Okay, binary is not the only thing that exists in the world, and there is in between and beyond the binaries which is to be explored. And that's where I believe, like United Nations, it has so many things that it tries to do. I don't know whether it succeeds fully, but it should also develop a kind of global policies that are to be in place with regard to sports, which is a very important aspect. That's where I would say, like, when we look at ethics, when we talk about ethics especially, I made this distinction between individual ethics and institutional ethics. And sports ethics is an institutional ethics, and all the stakeholders have to be consulted in making the policies. And there should not be any exclusion in terms of the definition of a person. Okay, if that happens, then you're always harming your own people, right? You're excluding majority of the people or minority of the people, and then going into a very biased kind of a perspective. So that's where I would believe this particular question that has come up is very important, and it has to generate a lot of awareness among the people with regard to the stakeholder, consulting the stakeholders. So that's where it has to begin.
Thank you very much, Professor Bala. Now, this conversation is very dynamic, and we have a lot that we can say, but our time is up. We have none left. But I'm sure that as we continue with this series, debates in sport, as we pick up these topics, as we continue to contemplate the nuance, the limiting effects, the ideals we strive for, and how we approach them, we can continue to converse. We can continue to trouble the taken for granted. I want to say a special thank you to our presenters this afternoon. I think definitely we not only we're enlightened, but we are left in a true contemplative mood. So thank you, Professor Travers, Dr. Sutherland, and Professor Bala. Of course, we want to thank the Faculty of Sport for starting the conversation and continuing it over time. This series will continue without an end. We'll call this the pilot. We're very, very happy to have this conversation going as we contend with hot topics in sport. With that said, have a wonderful afternoon. I am Sue-Ann Barrett, lecturer and head at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, and very happy to have partnered with our colleagues in sport. Have a great evening, everyone. Hi, Phil.